So yeah, we have Robert Green with us tonight. I don't know if you're familiar with him at all, but it's the first time meeting him for me as well. But he's a teacher, a high school teacher. He's sorry, there's someone joining. Welcome, Erwin. Thank you for joining. So, like I was saying, we have Robert Green with us. He's a history teacher and political candidate and activist and stuff. So, I thought it would be cool to have him talk with us. We've talked with other kind of political figures. This didn't really start as a political thing, and I don't really want it to necessarily be that either. But like, yeah, I think there's stuff to get out of this from Robert, but also to hear what everyone else has to say. So, um, yeah, thinking of these big issues and societal change, uh, actions and solutions to sustainability, climate crisis, social justice. Um, I guess something or one of the talking points we talk about is also these channels to change. So political channel is one of them. We think about Robert with us, education. That's another channel to change and getting people educated. Um, but I don't know where to start really. But like I guess this idea of in particular relevant now in terms of kind of what's going on in Canada and income and economics and people kind of needing to make a living and get by in kind of tough times and uh, yeah, what kind of role or how can we have governments that really take care of their citizens and have it so that they're supporting them. And we had this by the federal government, the CERB, which was one thing that they came out with. They have another thing coming out and uh, supporting people by giving them an actual income. So I don't know. I guess the question here is like, uh, how important or what sort of role does the government have in kind of taking care of its citizens and how can we or how can they do that and we do that in kind of a better way for everyone.
Yeah, so should I just dive into dive into that one?
Well, yeah, anyone who wants to take a yeah, go for it, Robert.
Sure. So, I guess the first thing that comes to mind just from what you're saying there is that, historically, and I'll be putting on my hat as a history teacher every now and then throughout this discussion, historically, it's really government that has been what the agent that has been able to step in to, make changes within market economies to bring about, a better standard of living for people. So, if we look back to, the changes that happened following the Great Depression, during the Second World War, and in the post-war years, we saw governments acting quite strongly, using their power on behalf of people. So doing things like raising taxes on the rich, increasing the top marginal tax rate, so that those who are making obscene amounts of money are having a lot of that that excess money that they have taxed. And we also saw a real willingness by the government to intervene in the economy in a number of ways. And when I think of what our government was able to do, for example, during the Second World War, I mean, it literally took over the economy. And in doing so, it made Canada like a meaningful participant in defeating the Nazis. And so, I think there's a lot of lessons in that we need to look at right now. Because the threat that we're facing in the world right now, and you kind of mentioned a couple threats there, and there are, to me, there's a twin threat out there, which is both the climate emergency, but also, as you mentioned, this radical rise in inequality that's been happening in countries like Canada and many other countries around the world. And if you followed or read the book by Thomas Piketty, Capital in the 21st Century, I mean, he's documenting a clear historical pattern, and we are on a trajectory right now. And if we don't put the brakes on this direction that we're going, we are soon going to be back in a world that has the kind of social structure that medieval Europe did in terms of sort of wealth concentration. And so all that to say, we need a government that is willing to exercise the power that government has, and I think that is really the root of the problem. Back in, I think it was like the late 90s, Linda McQuaig, who's a Canadian author who's written a lot about politics, wrote this great book called The Cult of Impotence, and she was basically saying that what neoliberal ideology was all about, and that had been adopted by the Chrétien government in that era, was about government being impotent with respect to its own power, refusing to act in the market to protect people, to protect the environment, and allowing market forces to have, I guess, the balance of power over government. And all this to say that until we address that issue and leave behind, I think this ideology of neoliberalism, we're not going to be able to solve the problems that we have, either of those crises. And the consequences of that are, as I'm sure you guys are all aware, very, very serious.
Yeah, it's a big piece there that I've discovered is like this, the role of the government, and they can really step in as an actor. Does anyone have anything to add to that, or thinking about the government's role and changes, structural changes too, is something we talk about a lot in these things. There's a lot you can do as an individual, sure, but to really have a big kind of impact, it needs to happen higher levels of, whether it's government or big corporations or whoever's in power. If anyone had anything to share.
The problem is, well, the people have allowed government to do whatever it wants. Is there a disagreement on that?
I would say, to the extent that we have bought into the ideology of neoliberalism, we are the ones that are electing neoliberal governments, over and over again, despite the fact that we're also the ones largely that are paying the price for that, in terms of, like, worsening quality of social programs, worsening working conditions for most Canadian workers, and an increasingly degraded environment, and again, moving closer and closer to environmental catastrophe in the world. So I think, and I think the issue is that government has been allowing corporate interests to do whatever it is they want, whether it be weaken the power of labor unions, or it's corporations that have been lobbying for tax cuts and trimming the social safety net, all of these sorts of things, and those have been the policies that, sadly, the governments that we've been electing have been enacting. And at a certain point, I think we have to say to those that are leading us, like, the jig is up, and this is not the kind of direction we want for our country or our world.
Well, I think a major problem is the head of the sand attitude. People really don't want to get involved. Well, a fair number of people don't want to get involved. If governments have the fear of God for the public, if they did something wrong, or just like against the general consensus, they would be a lot more attentive to the needs of individuals and larger segments of society.
Yeah, I mean, sorry.
Yeah, I was just gonna build on that and ask a question for for Robert is, how much do you think government should merely be reflecting what is people's will and implementing the public opinion versus leading that, and in the case of climate change, going further than the public will, even if the public isn't necessarily there? Like, how do you see the role of government in that sense?
Well, I think that what needs to happen, like honestly, like we've been talking about government as an instrument of change, but for me, the real engine of change that even precedes that are social movements. So if we look at major changes, especially progressive changes that have happened throughout history, they haven't been handed down to us for the most part from elected leaders. They've been hard fought battles that have come because of sacrifices of people like you and I, who have been willing to go out into the street and to protest, to engage in civil disobedience, and to really create pressure on government to do what's right, or else, I guess, face the wrath of the social movements. And so what I really believe needs to happen, and I guess this is part of the reason why I actually decided to run for the Green Party, is that I believe we need politicians who are willing to actually self-identify as part of these social movements and see themselves, their role, as attempting to be connected. And so just for example, at the time that I was running was right at the time we were having the massive climate marches here in Montreal. And, it was incredibly important for me to be there in the streets for each of those, and also to be, publicly supporting my students who were, walking out of class and going to those demonstrations. And so, when we have, I guess, politicians who are in some way accountable to social movements, I think that's when real change happens. And we've seen that throughout the history of Canada. I mean, Tommy Douglas's movement that emerged out of rural Saskatchewan was a great example of that. And they took what was a social movement and transformed that into political power and formed government, and then proceeded to bring in some of the most progressive changes that had been seen in Canadian history in terms of like provincial governments. So I guess that's a little bit how I see it. I think there needs to be that kind of connection to social movements that are democratic. And to me, that's a little bit different than just kind of a crass populism that is trying to pander to public opinion at all times, because social movements are formed with a vision, and it's about sort of pursuing that political vision.
Well, the movements to have the 3 reform bills in England to extend the franchise to the 1800s clearly showed that when you had a strong message and goal, governments were forced to listen. And in terms of votes for women, it took a lot longer, but the Pankhursts really worked hard and really did create a great social movement to get action taken.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I think that this comes up, or it's come up recently for me too, this idea that, yeah, I think politicians joining a movement or being very pro and open about like their part of this movement is like takes courage and like, a sense of like vulnerability to like step up and say like, I'm doing this. Like, it's not, I don't know, it's less of this like populism that you talk about.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a few points that you've come up in the past few minutes, but this idea of, you're mentioning like a year ago the climate marches and stuff, and I went to the ones this year too, and it was just, I'm imagining the difference between those two, and kind of, obviously we're in a pandemic, but still, like, I think it's sometimes disheartening to see that momentum kind of just die away. And yeah, does anyone have any thoughts of like how to carry this momentum? Like, is it really just this question of like leadership, or we had Greta last year, and then I don't know what she's doing. She's still busy, but like, how can we harness some of this momentum? Or there's a lot of energy too, or especially in the younger generations. As a teacher, and
Yeah.
a lot of people I talk to are they're totally aware of this stuff, and it's just kind of frustrating at the same time when it's not being really addressed to the scale we need it to be. So I don't know, any ideas on any of that spoke to anyone?
Well, part of the problem was all those people who marched at the rally for climate with Greta. Robert, was that about 500,000 people?
We had like, wasn't there like 500,000 at the big one?
Right, and how many of those the problem was that those people marched for the climate, but how many of them voted green? I mean, there was a major disconnect.
Yeah, well, you had Trudeau showing up to those protests himself, right? So, the liberals, and this is certainly something that I encountered a lot, knocking on doors, they have been very effective at portraying themselves as progressive and as environmentally conscious. But as we see, I mean, they're one day they're talking about the climate emergency, and the next day they're spending $12 billion of our tax dollars to build a pipeline, right? And so there is a lot of hypocrisy there. And so, but I guess the part of the problem is people buy into it, and as well, there's also the I guess the biggest challenge that I faced knocking on doors throughout NDG was the fear of the conservatives, right? Like, the number of times people said to me, "Look, we really like the Green Party. You seem like a great candidate. I would like to support you, but we're afraid that if we don't vote for the Liberals, the conservatives are going to get in." And I had many talking points to deal with that, but I have to say, it was a challenge to respond to, and I guess that's in many ways the product of our first past the post electoral system. It really forces people into that two-party mentality that makes it a big challenge for a party like the Green Party to make a breakthrough. I think we made great progress in the last election. We more than tripled the vote, for the Green Party, and managed to hit the threshold of 10%, which meant that a good chunk of our electoral expenses got reimbursed. So we're going to be in a very good position to fight the next time around. But it is a real uphill battle, particularly in this riding. Like, NDG Westmount is a liberal fortress, and fortresses don't go down easily.
Was there any discussion about it? I forget who, but did someone raise the idea, not just overall, about an environmental Bill of Rights?
Not that I'm aware of. Yeah, that I'm drawing a blank on.
Well, that would be, if we had something like that, that might be a great way to unite Canadians,
Mm-hmm.
to have an effective environmental Bill of Rights that had penalties and real goals.
Yeah, well, I mean, it would almost be I guess the one problem that I see with that is it's almost like what we don't need to be doing is making more commitments. We make commitments all the time. What we don't do is follow through on them, right? Like, so we have made commitments with respect to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and we're not meeting those obligations. We've made commitments with respect to the Paris Climate Agreement, and we're not meeting those commitments. So, like, for me, the issue is that we need to elect politicians that are serious, about about meeting those targets and about moving Canada in a different direction, both in terms of social but also ecological justice.
Yeah, in terms of that problem you brought up as well, kind of the electoral reform, and again, this is a big kind of structural problem that's not easy to tackle. So yeah, I don't know, how do you, yeah, how do we even think about changing that, or what is the real recourse? You're having the fact that there's all these people who could potentially be voting another party or whatever, but they're just kind of playing the tactical game just because of that's the way the system kind of works. So how do we, I don't know, is there any way to kind of start addressing that, or because I remember, even I think the liberals or whatever saying like, oh, we got to do electoral reform, but once you're in power, you're not going to say like, oh no, we need to change the way that I was able to get elected. So it's like,
Yeah.
how does
I
that
mean,
even start?
Trudeau, there was a famous quote from Trudeau in his first election. He was like, "Mark my words, this will be the last election with the first past the post system." And then, just as you say, sure enough, he wasn't going to then undo the very system that had put him into power. But this is a tough nut to crack. And one of the things that I definitely think about is like, you know, perhaps the Green Party and the NDP getting together in some kind of coalition. And one of the points of that coalition is to bring in proportional representation. Because as I guess this was another thing that I discovered knocking on doors during the election. The people who are supporting the Green Party and the NDP are generally the same sorts of voters. They generally want the same thing. They wanted to see action on the climate emergency, and they wanted to see more, spending on social programs, taxing the rich, a move towards social justice. And I know, in the leadership of these parties, that might be a tough sell, but I think that it's something that I think we all need to start talking about, and that activists in the two parties need to start talking about. It's a difficult nut to crack, but I think it might be worth it, and it might be one path that could possibly get us into a position where we could then bring in that electoral reform. So, but it's a big challenge.
Well, the Greens won 11 seats in the provincial legislature in PEI. What was the secret there, or what's the recipe that allowed that to happen?
Yeah, I mean, I think from what I understood, it was that the other parties were pretty weak, and the leader of the Green Party there in PEI was turned out to be quite popular. But I think also the timing. I mean, and it was a real shame that the Green Party was not able to capitalize on the timing of the big climate protests that occurred with Greta, during the last federal election. But I think more and more voters are thinking about the environment as an election issue, and I would hope that more and more people are seeing that continuing to support the Liberals is really just a losing strategy. They are a political party that is beholden to the interests of large corporations, and we see this in so many things that they do. I mean, just reading yesterday about how even their the Canada emergency wage subsidy that they gave, huge corporations were accepting those wage subsidies and then basically doling out the very same amount that they took in emergency wage subsidies in dividends to their shareholders. And some of the companies that were doing that were actually the very same companies that own these private long-term care facilities that have been, profiteering off of like the misery of our senior citizens for far too long. So, you know, again, like we need to to be able to elect a government that has the political will to challenge corporate power, not simply to pander to it. And that's sadly what we get with the liberals, though they talk a different talk.
Part of the problem too is Mark Garneau in the debates with you said that yes, we care about the environment, but if we don't develop the tar sands, we're not going to be able to pay for the social services that you enjoy.
Oh yeah, I mean, Garneau said a lot of things. He you know, committed straight up that during this mandate they would end the boil water advisories, and you know, in indigenous communities. And we just saw the Liberal government basically making an yet another admission that they're not going to be able to do that. You know, despite the fact that the Trudeau government right now is you know, borrowing in what amounts to interest-free loans, about $4 billion a week from the Bank of Canada. And you know, this is maybe another interesting topic we could talk about this evening at some point, because you know what Trudeau is proving by doing that is that, you know, it's not the financial ability that we lack in terms of addressing these problems, whether it be, you know, lack of clean water in indigenous communities, or you know, money to invest in green infrastructure. We have the ability to do it. All we lack is the political will. And so, you know, I think that's another area where we need to see, I think, government use the power that it has. And one of the powers that it has is to create money, and do so in the public interest.
I guess in terms of sustainability, you know, if Canadians actually paid the full price of a product in terms of how the materials were sourced, used, manufactured, and recycled, that might wake people up to the real crisis we're facing.
Absolutely. I mean, there's there's any number of things that we could be doing to address this problem, you know, that we're not. So so yeah, it is a question of political will.
There's another thing that you'd mentioned earlier was this, and we mentioned in one of our other discussions actually, and it points to this bigger question I think I have of kind of transparency or informing, or even maybe education, and getting to really know what is happening behind closed doors or in our kind of parliament. And I think in a lot of cases, if we were just aware of what was going on or the things that were happening, we'd be pretty irate and maybe more inclined to tackle these problems. And one of the things you'd mentioned, and Dylan, who's here with us, mentioned to me, and I had even known, was this wealth tax that was just yeah, beaten down or whatever, didn't go through. And that's kind of an easy one small easy fix, so to speak, of really thinking about you know, people that should be paying for things. So what do you, I don't know, what are your ideas on not just the wealth tax, but how we can, yeah, hold our governments more accountable? And I think, yeah, the media plays kind of a big role in that, informing us and what's happening. And I don't think that's really happening with mainstream media, at least. So I don't know, anyone have ideas on how to tackle that or think about that?
Well, it would be nice if the CBC Global and CTV devoted 3 minutes a night to environmental issues on their broadcasts. For example, Terry DeMonte from Show, when he goes on panels on CJAD, he says, you know, I hear people complain about the tar sands, but I've been to Alberta. It's not as bad as people seem to say. And then he berates them for for attacking the tar sands development and pipelines. And like if you say, well, I've seen the videos of the areas where the development takes place, it's a disaster. He just goes, well, you haven't been there personally.
Well, and this speaks to a much bigger problem, which is that our media is owned by the same corporations that are profiting from the destruction of our environment and the exploitation of workers and all of this. Because, and just to return to what you said earlier, Toby, I mean, I guess this is the big issue. If Canadians knew, the things that were actually going on in their government, and the sad thing is that they don't, because the media isn't really reporting on it. Like, just for example, when I was running against Marc Garneau, like before taking on that challenge, I did a lot of research and I read some books. And for example, I read a really great book that was written about the disaster in Lac-Mégantic. And the details of that story are they make your head spin. It's literally that government allowed industry to regulate itself, and despite warning after warning that this was going to result in disaster, the government did nothing. And even after the disaster, so like 4 years after Lac-Mégantic, there was almost an identical train accident that occurred in British Columbia. It was the same sort of story. A train parked on a hill. They didn't put enough of the handbrakes because there are no regulations for how many handbrakes you're supposed to put to keep things safe. And so the train went down. Now, fortunately, this time it didn't kill, it didn't just destroy an entire town and kill 50 people, but it did kill 2 or 3 people, if I'm not mistaken, some rail workers. And those deaths were utterly unnecessary. And if the regulatory agency that Marc Garneau oversees, Transport Canada, was doing its job to protect the public interest and not sort of run cover, for these rail companies that had, massively increased their profits, like right before that disaster, because it was all about transporting shale oil from the Midwest of the United States to refineries in New Brunswick. And prior to, like, he was allowing trains that were basically giant, 100-car long ticking time bombs to go on rickety old rail lines that were, built to, have much shorter trains that were transporting wood on them instead of like heavy oil. So, all this to say, like, it's an example of what we call regulatory capture, where agencies that
I'm going to just cut you off just because it's about to end.
No problem.
But we'll pick up on the same point and
perfect.
Just join the same link. Sorry, I didn't want to.
That's great. Thank you. That went fast. Good. Pretty much any expert in rail safety would have said is an insane idea, but they got it, and that allowed them to very recklessly increase their profits at the expense of the safety of workers.
So you're bringing up another issue too that I find.
Today's sustainability meeting thing with Cruising.
Oh, Chris, we can hear you.
Excuse me. Go ahead.
But, okay, thanks. Yeah, you bring up this other issue of in terms of the political levels and transparency and accessibility, and it's been very interesting just taking on this sustainability thing and kind of having, I reached out to politicians at different levels and was gotten back to by my mayor and different local politicians, and the one who never got back to me was like my federal rep, and I'm under the impression it's their job to take care of what their citizens need and everything. And so how do we go about you know, getting heard as a Canadian citizen, and voicing our opinions, and getting change to happen? What are some things
You know,
we can do?
I have to commend you guys for this, for what you're doing right here, because this is, I think, the sort of thing that we need more of. You know, citizens coming together and talking about what kind of society it is that we want, and rolling up our sleeves and trying to figure out how we can actually achieve that kind of society. And you know, I think it's awful that Mark Garneau won't come and have this kind of discussion with you guys. Like, it, you know, if you're there to represent you know, this community, this is exactly the kind of, you know, event that you should want to be part of. But I guess, you know, there's worry about, I guess, what sort of questions they might be asked, if it was going to make them uncomfortable. But you know, I think that we need a different kind of politician. I think we need, you know, the kind of politician. I mean, I managed to watch a bit of your session with Sue Montgomery, and that was great. I think that's exactly the kind of spirit that we need from our politicians. Politicians who are willing to, you know, come in a spirit of openness and engage in discussions with citizens. And you know, I think that if you know, I think if Mark Garneau did that more frequently, then perhaps he might, you know, feel a little bit more uncomfortable about some of the decisions that he's making in terms of, you know, pandering to corporate interests, right? And you know, realizing how this affects his own constituents and the country more broadly, being connected with real people. So, you know, I think that is certainly you know, a major start. And I think it's out of these kinds of discussions that we see a lot of good things happen, and often that spills over into social movements and you know, that sort of thing. So I'm not sure if I answered your question well there, though, but
Well, yeah, it's I guess, yeah, I'm looking for, like, yeah, more in terms of, if we're thinking of, yeah, what we can do, and like, that's kind of like the whole, I guess I realized too that even just having rhetoric or discussion, that's kind of one step in it, I guess, the whole process. But it's frustrating because we're all well aware of kind of the urgency. There's an urgency to everything, I think, right now. And
yeah,
um, but there's also, yeah, I think I've mentioned this to people before, but like, this pandemic in general is giving me a sense of optimism, in the sense that we have been able to really, or the governments have been able to, like, step in and say, okay, we're going to try to tackle this and do it. I guess now we're kind of, people are getting a bit, like, lagging on and whatever, but there was kind of this will, governments and people too, to get behind this problem that's really like a immediate health problem to people, and kind of banding together. It reminds me a lot of the climate emergency, and so if we can maybe harness these types of will and power in that kind of way too, and to try to tackle this problem, because it's not like the solutions aren't out there. We have, you know, these people came up with the vaccine in like under a year, and like, there's so much brain power and technology, and you know, it's not like we're lacking solutions really. It's more the implementation part. So um, I guess that's where the snag keeps coming up, and how, yeah, how we get around to that. Did anyone?
Toby, if I can jump in, and I should say I come to this conversation not exactly as a civilian, but as someone who's worked in politics and for over a decade at the federal, provincial, and municipal level now. So I know what gets politicians' attention, and I'll say that I think people often underestimate their own impact. And from my perspective, and this is building on some of our earlier discussions, sadly, there's so few people engaged. There's so few people writing to politicians, marching in the street, voting in elections. And obviously, I'm someone who's engaged in the political process, and I recognize that there's lots of other ways to affect social change through social movements and all kinds of other important ways. But the point I want to make is there's so few people that are engaged that, in fact, you do make a difference. And even on Toby's point about being disappointed that your federal member of parliament didn't get back to you, they may very well have read your letter, even if they didn't get back to you. And I'm not making excuses for that. But just because they didn't get back to you, like I say, doesn't mean they didn't read it, and doesn't mean it didn't have an impact. And I think that's something that you guys should all keep in mind and really not give up on. That I think a very simple letter to your representatives can be very effective. It doesn't have to be fancy or researched or footnotes or well documented, but saying, hey, I'm a resident of your district or of your riding, and I care about climate change a lot, can be very effective. And I'm happy to talk more about that if that's what folks are interested. I don't want to hijack the conversation, but that's sort of my message to all of you tonight is your politicians are paying attention. I've never met a politician that says, well, I don't care what my voters think of me. I don't care if they vote for me or not. I'm just going to ignore all the messages they send me.
Well, actually, we have a number of those in Canada who just ignore it until the party line. It's very unfortunate. As an example, you have Alan D'Souza saying I'd like to protect more of the Technopark wetlands that are under threat of destruction, and yet he's the very mayor who served on the board of the Technopark Development Company that delisted secured green space for development. We have far too many conservatives and liberals, especially Garneau, who just says yes, sir, every time he's asked a question or given a request.
Yeah, I really agree with what Annalisa was saying there. Like, I think, part of our dilemma is that we don't really fully realize the power that we do have. And like, so there are, I think, sort of structural forces that are pushing government in certain directions. And, that has to do with lobbyists. It has to do with sort of ideology and a number of different things like that. However, people can be a countervailing force there and start to push things in opposite directions. Now, I was saying earlier, my ideal is to have, people in government that are open to working with social movements and bringing their vision into government. But I also recognize that, like, some of the most important progressive changes that have been achieved throughout history have been done by governments that wouldn't have done them otherwise had it not been for the pressure created by citizens. And so, as Annalisa mentioned there, that pressure can take all kinds of forms. And, so I teach a course in Sec 5 that's called The Contemporary World. And I guess my main mission in that course is to try to get kids excited about politics. And, one of my favorite quotes that I usually start the year off is like, turn on to politics before politics turns on you. And there's too many of us that have sort of, oh, politics, that's not for me. I don't get involved in that. That's for activists, as opposed to something that we should all be engaged in because it's part of our sort of communal life. And that said, I do think that sort of the organizations and institutions that we create to facilitate democracy really do matter, and that we can do a much better job of facilitating participation of citizens than we're doing right now. But that the lack of those structures, I guess, shouldn't stop, I guess, citizens from working on, you know, a movement to build those structures and to have their voices, you know, affect power. And I guess that's sort of the bottom line.
Actually, Robert, 2 points. Rachel Carson with Silent Spring got the ear of President Kennedy, and rapidly he brought in legislation to ban DDT, and the movement to have Earth Day led to the Endangered Species Act and the EPA. Is there, from what you see, do we have anything on the horizon in Canada that has the same type of force and supporters?
You know, if the latest report from the IPCC isn't enough to jar you into serious action, you know, I don't know what it is. I mean, you know, the ecological science right now is unbelievably depressing. You know, all of the positive feedback cycles that the scientists had warned would happen are happening. You know, the corals are being bleached. The permafrost is no longer holding carbon, it's releasing carbon. You know, the Arctic ice is melting, and the water is warming there. So, you know, it's because of that I think that, like, the information isn't enough. Like, we need to get to the root of the interests that are pushing the world in destructive directions, and that's why I think, you know, whatever we're doing in social movements or in government, it really has to be about talking seriously about reining in the power of private corporations, because they are ultimately, you know, behind so many of the problems that we have in our world right now, from the issues around biodiversity to the climate issues to you know, rising inequality, and you know, the plastics that are filling our ocean and all of this sort of thing. So you know, I think we need to look at these issues with our eyes open and recognize where power is, and recognize that until we can dismantle that power, we're not going to be able to, I think, move in the kind of direction that you know, we've been talking about moving in for so long, but we haven't succeeded in going in.
Has anyone read Neil Postman's Abusing Ourselves to Death?
No, I haven't.
Oh, it's basically about how we take how the public takes Hollywood and silly entertainment and other things more seriously than real issues that should grip the nation.
Yeah, if we think about that, you mentioned so we talked a lot about kind of the government and that change and channel, but I think really a lot of the power is, it's almost kind of hidden and in these other big corporations and other players and actors that have a really big impact. And you know, me as one person, if I decide to, you know, be carbon zero or whatever, it's like a drop in the ocean in comparison to if the biggest, you know, producer of whatever just decides to make a more sustainable choice or whatever it is. So what are sort of ways that we can even wrap our heads around, you know, getting some sort of impact on that level? Because it's again, it seems you know, people are educated, and there's almost the, like Erwin said, the head in the sand happening with people too, because like we everyone knows this stuff, and it's like you kind of want to ignore it because it's just too big, too like, too much, you don't feel like you can do anything. So yeah, what sort of ways are able to like get to that sort of problem of corporate interests and voicing there where there really is a lot of kind of power lying there?
Well, that's the big challenge, and I think that's where it's really about. I think bringing to power people who are ready to look at that and address that question of power. And I think, like, again, we have the tools. That this is I guess this is the thing that I always find so frustrating, is that, like, the solutions are there. Like, the only thing that we lack right now is the political will to go there. And again, just, you were talking about things that are kind of kept in the dark. One of the things that I think is kept in the dark, that we all need to learn a little bit more about, is about the way that money is created, about what we call monetary policy in government. Because what Trudeau has just done for this pandemic, is he's proven that it is that we don't need to rely exclusively on raising taxes to pay for all of the things that we need to do. The idea that the Bank of Canada can simply buy the government's debt, and that those debts never really have to be paid off. That's the thing. Like, you only have to worry about paying off debts to your own central bank if inflation starts to go up. But that we are so far away from sorting that wall. And again, just to put on my history teacher's hat, like, this is how Canadians are unaware of the fact that, like, the way we pulled ourselves out of the Great Depression, the way that we won the Second World War, and the way that we built most of Canada's modern infrastructure, and in fact, the way that we built Canada's middle class, was largely through interest-free loans from the Bank of Canada. And beginning in the 1970s, we stopped using the Bank of Canada, to the same extent for that. And it was at that time that we started to see debts go up. Because if we needed to borrow more than we were raising in taxes, what did we do? We borrowed from private banks, or we borrowed from foreign governments. And all of those debts came with interest that we had to pay back. And so, all of that has built up to rationalize, to serve as a rationale for austerity, for cutting our social programs. Like, we've been told by our governments for the last 30 years, we're living beyond our means. We can't afford to have this healthcare system anymore. We can't afford to have a great education system. We can't afford unemployment insurance, all of these sorts of things. And what Trudeau has just with a very quick decision that did not get any attention in the media, he's proving that it doesn't have to be that way, that we can use a combination of fiscal and monetary policies to attack this problem, just as we did during the Second World War and in the period after that. And so I think making people aware that we're not impotent, that we can we can fix these problems if we put our if we work on it collectively together, and then, I guess, put into power the sorts of people that are willing to move in the direction that so many people want to move in. And I guess, just to finish on this point, like, the other thing that I saw when I was knocking on doors, throughout NDG Westmount, and we knocked on a lot of doors during that campaign, was that, people are legitimately concerned about the climate emergency. Like, this is not something that, like, people are aware of it, people want action, and even those people who were telling me that they weren't going to vote for me, that they were going to vote for Justin Trudeau or for Marc Garneau, actually, even those people, in my conversations with them, they were deeply disturbed by this issue. And I think that they turn to the Liberals out of any, like, thinking that there's not really much hope with the other parties, and that, not really understanding that there is a vision. I think I'm biased on this one, obviously, but I chose to run for the Green Party because I saw that its platform represented, I think, the vision that from what I was hearing from people, that they want to see in government. People want to see better social programs. People want to see less inequality. People want to see governments investing in sustainability and renewing our infrastructure in ways that will not threaten our children's future. And the number of families as well, that the number of times I would knock on the door and I was like, I'm here for the Green Party, and they'd be like, kids, go get your signs from the protest march to show Mr. Green. Like, I have to say, like, that was one of the nicest things about doing that campaign, was those moments with people and sharing those exchanges. So all that to say, that gave me hope. Like, this is what people want, and I just think our politics is a little bit behind. I do believe that in the coming years we are going to see that kind of transformation. And I think the movement that Bernie Sanders led in the United States is an illustration of how people are ready to get in, get behind a real transformative program, political program that will really address these problems that so many of us want to see addressed. Sorry, that was a long rant.
Well, so what do people see as like the if there is this will, at least by the Greens or whoever comes along, like, what is kind of stopping that from really gaining traction, momentum? Like you mentioned Sanders, like he really took a foothold and he was, whatever. We don't want to get into that, but like, what sort of, maybe as someone who's working with the Green Party and stuff, like, or anyone who's had an experience of thinking about growing some sort of movement or organization, and what are some of the challenges that come along with that? Like, what is kind of limiting the Greens to only getting this many votes? Like, sure, people, it's kind of this cycle of like, okay, it's almost like they need to get a certain amount of votes for anyone to vote for them, but they're never going to get that amount because no one's voting for them. So it's like, what has to happen to like kind of change that?
Well, yeah, I think, I guess a combination of factors. I mean, we saw the NDP have the orange wave, several years ago, where they swept Quebec. Like, particularly in Quebec, I think there is hope that we will see a green wave coming in the future, because Quebecers are their environmental values are very strong. They're maybe a little bit more cynical about the Liberal Party than in some other parts of Canada, and maybe more apt to turning to an alternative. They're also a bit more tuned in with European politics, and we've seen, in Europe, Greens making that breakthrough finally. So, and I have to admit that I was frustrated by the fact that part of my campaign had to be about competing with the NDP, because again, the NDP candidate in NDG Westmount, we had it out at the debates, but he's a really good guy. I think, I respect his politics a lot, and had he won instead of me, I would have loved to see him in power instead of Mark Garneau, just to say. And so, and there was certainly at the level of the national campaign, there was some ugliness between the Green Party and the NDP that I just found like neither of the parties or their activists should have been engaging in that kind of partisan sniping. I think that both of those parties should have stayed focused on the Liberals, on the party in power. But I guess again, I would like to see, the supporters of those two parties come together in some way, because I think when we're divided, it really is a major advantage for the two corporate parties, be it the Conservatives or the Liberals.
On your point, Anthony Paul got 32% of the vote in Toronto Centre. The Liberal got 41%, and the NDP had 16%, which gave the Liberal the win.
Yep, absolutely. The math didn't quite add up for us in NDG Westmount last time, the combined Green NDP vote. We still would have lost to Mark Garneau, but I think we possibly would have been more likely to be seen as a competitor, as like a realistic option. And it would have made the arguments at the door for switching the vote sort of that much easier if we were within striking distance. So, and I think that is true, across Canada. Now, I'm fully aware that there are differences between the platforms of the Green Party and the NDP, and I certainly spent some time during the election criticizing the NDP's platform, but I just see that at the base, the supporters of these parties, they really share the same values. They want to see a Canada that is more socially just and that is, respecting the science of both the climate emergency and the emergency with respect to biodiversity.
Well, the problem is the Liberals are going to co-opt NDP and Green policies, even if they don't fulfill them.
Yeah.
So thinking about wrapping this up, we have 10 minutes or so. So I really like to try to brainstorm if we can either shoot any ideas of really kind of concrete actions that either each one of us can take, or, ideas that might lead to something. So I liked, Erwin mentioned this earlier, of like just having like a 3-minute thing on the news, or which I'd never heard of, and any other ideas, or even just hearing you talk now about, parties, like why do we even need parties? Like, why can't we just vote for good policies, good ideas? And I don't know, I never crossed my mind, but it's like we're constantly like dividing each other and like going into different parties and then making decisions that don't make sense. They only make sense for like, because you want to stay with the party and whatever. But it's like, I don't know, we all gotta make smart decisions. It's like, not as a party, but as a country. Anyone else have any things that came up for them, ideas or actions, kind of concrete things? And you can really be silly about it too, just some ideas.
I'm going to I'll throw one out that's related to the point that I was making earlier. So I was talking about how the federal government is, managing to borrow large sums from the Bank of Canada in order to pay for the pandemic. I would like to see our municipal governments ask for a piece of that pie, because so much of what we need to change in terms of to create a sustainable society is happening at the municipal level, and municipal governments are just inadequately funded. They don't have the tax money that they need to meet the needs of urban dwellers, especially when it comes to having a sustainable society. And so, one thing that I would like to see is I would like to see Valerie Plante. I would like to see, Projet Montréal, put out a public call. Justin Trudeau, you're literally printing $4 billion a week to fund this. How about you use some of that or print a little bit more to make sure that every city in Canada has the best public transportation system that money can buy, and that we plant all those trees that they talked about planting in the last election, and do things like that. So I'd like to fix some of those problems in terms of helping cities green themselves.
I, of course, cannot agree more. In a context, too, where cities have more and more responsibilities, things like homelessness, more and more are falling on a city responsibility, which 10 years ago, no one thought of cities as a response to that in terms of social programming, in terms of green infrastructure, and I find personally the tree planting policy maddening, because the federal government has promised to plant 2 billion trees, but the reality is that they can only plant on federal land. So there is not that much federal land in this country. It's mostly things like airports and military bases and marine ports. So I don't think they're about to take all of the military bases and turn them into forests.
Wouldn't that be nice? That is such a beautiful idea right there.
Regardless, I don't think you could fit 2 billion trees on all of the federal lands. So as a municipality, and I'll speak for the Borough of Côte-des-Neiges NDG, where our goal is to plant about 800 trees a year. And we would plant more if we had more money to do so. So, and I've had this conversation with the Liberal government as well directly, and said, hey, municipality here, give us money, give us your trees. That's one that jumps out at me. And I'll say in terms of a takeaway, talk to your elected representatives. If you haven't heard from them lately, send them a note, send them an email. And again, it can be just a couple lines on something you care about, whether that's sustainability or another issue, and just say, I really care about sustainability. The end. Like, does not have to be fancy. I really want to emphasize that. I think certainly when I was getting involved in politics, and I'm mindful of the time, like I was very nervous and was like, okay, I'm writing to my member of parliament. I better, spell everything correctly, and this better be well researched and well worded. And that is not the case. Just write to them, and when it's election time or when you have the occasion to do so, attend those town halls, attend those debates, and let them know what you care about, and vote, of course.
And if I could just add one thing, just to any of you and to anyone that might end up watching this, in the video cast later, if you are looking to get involved in trying to change things, the Green Party's Riding Association in NDG Westmount is just really becoming very active. Lots of great people getting involved in it, and we're always looking for more people to become involved. So, if you are looking for a place to get politically involved, this is a great place for you, and we're looking to expand as much as we can.
Does anyone else have any crazy ideas or actions they can think about?
Well, Robert, when you spoke with the electors during the campaign, what were the top 5 items that there was a general consensus on that they wanted action.
Well, I found when I was presenting myself as a candidate, I was kind of speaking about three things that were really important to me: the climate emergency, social justice, having better funded social programs, and reconciliation with Indigenous people. And I have to say, I met very few people that didn't seem to support each of those three things. I think the voters in NDG Westmount are pretty progressive, and I do really believe that there is potential for a breakthrough at some point for the Green Party in this riding. Just as we saw, like, Sue Montgomery didn't expect that she was going to get elected when she ran, and people came out and voted for her. So there's certainly I think, a lot of potential in this area.
Because if people were to say, do you think we can get a common consensus to say that we have to limit the growth of the tar sands, stop the construction of new tar sands pipelines, stop deforestation, reduce plastic use in a serious way, as opposed to the legislation that the Liberals brought in? Or would people agree? Do you think people would agree to that?
Sorry, can you just repeat that one time for me?
Yeah, people agree to limit the expansion of the tar sands or reduce.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Stop building pipelines, things like that.
I do have to say, there were some people that did kind of buy into Justin's line that, like, we're gonna run the tar sands in order to pay for the climate transition, but most didn't. I would say that most people were fairly skeptical of that, and I see we're running out.
Yeah, and you've also kind of shown that that's not even true, because you can just print money. Okay, well, yeah, we're wrapping up here, so I wanted to just thank everyone for showing up, and I'll have another one of these in the future for sure. Thanks to Robert, thanks to Kaylee, Erwin, James, Dylan, Chris, Annalisa, Robin.